1941 and stayed married about 65 years. Now, if I've done it right, these stories read not like journalism, but short stories. They do have hopeful endings. The couples do wind up married. But I didn't want to sugarcoat their journeys. They meet in these amazing ways. But after that, their love affairs start to look like many others. There are ups and downs, there are misunderstandings, there are a couple of broken engagements before they finally find their footing. Still, is there an element of escapism in this book? Yeah. I mean, I won't kid you. This is a hopeful book. I think the New York Times has a short write-up of this in tomorrow's paper, and I think the lead is Mr. Sabar is shamelessly romantic. Guilty is charged, I guess. But these are fun stories. But they're not. I don't want people to think, is this not going to feel real? Because I think, although they have, they're hopeful, I don't sugarcoat sort of the rough patches in these journeys. And one of the other things I do is shy away from words like fate and destiny. It would be tempting to say that these couples were meant to be. But as I saw them, they weren't meant to be. And what's remarkable and wonderful is that they happened anyway. Nearly all the men and women I interviewed seemed achingly aware of the improbability of their meeting, let alone marrying. Several at first lied to relatives about how they met, fearful of how it might look. You picked up a guy in the park? Some returned to the places where they met, reenacting their movements like accident investigators at the scene of a crash. Others found way to sanctify chance. The Holters, who met on the ferry to the Statue of Liberty, married on Valentine's Day. The Langfords, who met at Central Park, married on Thanksgiving, as did the Capels, who collided at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One couple named their daughter Valentina. Jean Lynch, who found her Danny at Grand Central Terminal, wrote up her How We Met story for the local newspaper, for Newsday, as a 50th anniversary present to her dying husband. I've come to believe that places do give people a push, but after that I think people make their own luck. You have to venture something. You have to take a gamble. You have to know, and you do risk something. There's always the risk of rejection, of a backlash, of telling, being told off or to get lost. But all these folks, in all these cases, the spaces did give the people a push, but ultimately someone had to reach out to somebody else. And the millions of times in which one person did not reach out to someone else are sort of well chronicled in kind of the missed connections ads in the local paper. These were all these wonderful moments where something might have grown. I don't know what the statistics are and how many of those ads actually lead to people reuniting, but I suspect not many. And you just wonder if they had reached out, if they just acted on that impulse, what might have come of those relationships. All the couples do wind up married, and that's a kind of happy ending, or at least a happy middle. But the moving thing for me is that before getting there, they start, like all of us, in a place of loneliness and isolation. And I'll read you from one of the stories here. This is a couple, sort of one of the more sort of educated, sophisticated couples in the book, Mara and Bob Capel, who met at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 1970s. And one of the things I did while I was researching the book is I interviewed each spouse separately. I didn't want, what happens when a couple tells a story, right? It gets political, there's a kind of convergence of facts and a lot of self-censorship. So I interviewed each spouse separately over the phone for several hours, and then I met them in person to sort of see and sort of truth test the stories. And one of the neat things, one of the things I tried to do in telling the stories is switch back and forth between the spouses so that you see them approaching this common ground, but they're in very different places in their head. This is a chapter called Renovations, Metropolitan Museum of Art. When Mara Galitis awoke, the tiny apartment above the drugstore on Lexington Avenue still smelled like a spice bazaar. The night before had been her Christmas party, an annual rite now well known among her acquaintances for the elaborate and sometimes eccentric dishes she prepared. At age 33, Mara had yet to outgrow her introversion. Her parents were old-world Latvian aristocrats who believed that the highest virtue in children was silence. She had hated that part of her childhood, though its after-effects were still with her. Her party, her only one each year, had always been strategic. With this one social nicety, she hoped to discharge an entire year's social debts. She invited everyone who had asked her to anything. Her guest list was a bricolage of the disparate world she straddled. A student from ballet class, a friend from her days as a substitute teacher in Harlem, a German from the office. This year, in 1975, Mara made rijstafel, a traditional Dutch Indonesian feast. It meant rice table, but it was actually a vast smorgasbord of appetizers and pungent sauces, or sambals set out in small dishes and served with a variety of cooked grains. Mara had spent a week gathering ingredients for chili paste, chutneys, banana fritters, coconut-dusted peanuts, and tofu omelets. What she may have lacked in social effusion, she sought to make up for in the assertiveness of her food. The year before, she had made the Brazilian national dish, feijoada. The party fell on a Saturday, and for a shimmering moment, when the apartment was full and there was laughter and music and people were eating and talking and playing records, she felt she belonged. But then, one by one, her guests went home, as they always did, and the apartment was again, as so often, still. When she crawled out of bed at 3 the next afternoon, the room was cold and the sky was already streaked violet and gray. She glanced up at the ceiling. In a flight of whimsy not long ago, she had painted it with a trompe-l'oeil of a bright blue sky, dabbed with puffs of cloud. But it didn't help. It was December 21st, the winter solstice, and the gloom outside her window made her feel even more alone. For Bob Capel, Sundays brought a sense of exhausted possibility. Sundays were the stern-faced schoolmarm standing, arms crossed, at the end of each week, reminding us of life's relentless repetition, of the futility of escape. For much of this cold, gray day, he knocked about the apartment, pacing the parquet floors and thinking that his psychoanalytic session, another shrink, the next morning could not come too soon. His mother, a French teacher, had died of a brain tumor when he was 20, and when she left the world, something of himself went with her. The lessons of tradition and purpose the rabbis had taught at the yeshiva in Queens seemed suddenly hollow. What did they know of the real world, of its cruel exactions? It was shameful for a grandson and nephew of great rabbis to think this way, yet it was how he felt. Looked at in a certain light, the 8 years since his mother's death had been a search for a replacement. If not for her exactly, then for meaning. After graduating from Yeshiva University, he signed up with the Vista program and taught school in Harlem for a year. When his tour was over, he enrolled in a doctoral program in philosophy at Columbia, finding intellectual solace in the writings of the existentialists and phenomenologists. For 4 years, Bob worked, if without much conviction, toward a Ph.D. But then, around the time of a breakup with a longtime girlfriend, he dropped out. And all that remained now was psychoanalysis. Its focus on dreams and symbols and on enigmas of mind and self was about the only thing in his life that felt real. Lying on the couch, still in his underwear, he ran his fingers over the stubble on his face. He wondered, mostly as an intellectual exercise, how long it had been since his last shave. Then, studying the runic shapes of clouds lolling past the window of his East 85th Street apartment, he fell asleep. He woke in a fog. He looked at his watch, 3:05 p.m., and then at the front door. A scornful pile of unopened mail filled a stand by the doorway, and for a moment he considered opening a few letters. Leafing the pile in search of a safe place to start, he found the square-shaped program from his visit the week before to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When he was a boy, the Met was one of the few places besides synagogues, Shabbat dinners, and bar mitzvahs where his mother and father took him on weekends. He came to see it as a kind of secular temple. It was in some ways the last tether to his past. Under the listings for December 21st was a lecture on the Christmas story in painting, and a film, A Child's Christmas in Wales. Great, he thought, shaking his head, and understanding why his parents often skipped the museum in late December. Deeper in the program, though, he noticed a few exhibits he hadn't had time for. Just an hour or so was left before closing. He put on a ragged pair of Levi's, a wool sweater, and a red hunting coat. Then he headed out of his building into the frostbit air. So I'll fast forward a bit here. They both wind up in the museum. Mara is looking at a tapestry, actually one that they would later discover was called The Story of the Redemption of Man. When Bob sort of notices her across the medieval sculpture hall and is just sort of taken by her. I guess Mara is and was a very attractive young woman, and I think she caught a lot of guys' eyes. But Bob was sort of taken by her, and when he sort of turns around again to see where she's gone, she's disappeared. So he's sort of, the museum is about to close. He sort of frantically is running around trying to find her again. He, of course, hadn't said a single word to her. And then he goes up to the second floor, and there's a special exhibition that the Met had put on in 1975, where it basically examined itself. It sort of cast. It was a very 1970s thing to do. Sort of let's cast an eye on how we collect paintings. Let's showcase the best of our collection. And in fact, again, as a writer, as a nonfiction writer, you're always happy when factual stories lend metaphor to what you're trying to write. And this exhibit was called Patterns of Collecting. We'll begin as Bob, again, where Bob is now entering this special exhibition. Let's see. Up the escalator and past the European painting rooms, Bob entered the new exhibit, searching. He had somehow missed this in the program, but what an idea. The Met had lowered its drawbridge. It was letting people inside the castle. It had given in to the urge to tell its own story, to make sense of the past 10 years of its life. The museum, Bob thought appreciatively, was in psychoanalysis. The museum had even made public the examination list curators used to size up possible acquisitions. Bob studied the dozen or so stages of evaluation: immediate impression, description, condition, wear, and age, style, history, outside expert advice, scientific analysis, doubts list, then conclusion. Does the work stack up to the original impression? I kid you not, this was all part of the exhibit. He walked past a Renaissance bed, a terracotta relief by Thorvaldsen, I'm probably mispronouncing some of these, and some carvings from pre-Columbian Mexico before finding himself in a room of Egyptian antiquities, a quartz lion god from 3100 BC, a limestone bust of a king, the head of Amenhotep III, carved in black stone. The room was half lit, and Bob had thought it empty. But then he heard a footstep at the other end and froze. Her. Behind the cascades of blonde hair was an intelligent, almost philosophical face. With her fingers laced behind her back, she was studying the plaque beside some ruin. A vision. That was the word that came to him, vision. With his arms clasped behind his back, he moved toward her, keeping his eyes on the display cases. It's funny, he began, looking at her for a second, then back at the display. This term dynasty they've got on all the panels, weren't the historical periods in Egypt called kingdoms? He was blessed, or cursed, he sometimes thought, with an almost perfect recall of trivia from the classes he'd taken in college as breadth requirements. At parties with other graduate students, he found that these morsels, when strategically dispensed, gave him a worldly air. But the woman turned and stepped to the next case without so much as a glance. Did she think he was talking to someone else? Maybe she didn't hear? Bob caught up to her and said, "Did you have a chance to see any of the Cyclidic figurines in the other room? I don't think it occurred to me until today just how much influence they must have had on Brancusi's work from the 30s. Have you seen these figures at the Guggenheim?" She tilted her head only far enough for him to see her roll her eyes. Then she stalked away. Just behind him now, a voice, stentorian, effulgent. It hooked him like a gaff to the neck. "Why, young man," it said, "I could not agree more with what you just said." His first impression after turning around was not a pleasant one. Just 5 inches away, with a smile that seemed to express gratitude, was a strong-shouldered matron in her early 60s, white curls festooning a red face and bifocals, her girth magnified by a lumpy black coat. The absurdity of the situation settled around him like the walls of a padded cell. "With what I just said?" Bob said. "Who else, silly?" she said. "Brancusi, of course, Brancusi. Never in this museum have I heard anything so incisive. And from Mrs. Silverman, you should know. That's a high compliment." God save me, Bob thought. Mara had perfected the art of escape. Her long blonde hair, slim physique, and Scandinavian-looking features drew constant stares from men, some of whom apparently felt it reasonable to simply start following her. Her life was in this way a paradox. She was a loner with too much would-be company, most of it male. Mara wasn't like those of her friends who, for fear of being alone, strung one boyfriend along until a better one came along. Men, with their persistence, their need to control, made her easily claustrophobic. Mara had made peace with loneliness as a girl. She had learned compensations. And so the moment a boyfriend fell short, she was gone. She was a distaff Houdini, particularly when some stranger was in pursuit, as there appeared to be now. She considered the options: duck through a side door to the women's restroom, flee to another wing of the museum, or just leave. She had been enjoying the exhibit. She didn't want to leave, but there was his voice again with another pretentious observation. She could feel that he was close. She knew that if she so much as glanced his way, he would take encouragement. So she turned away, dropping her gaze to the floor and taking in to her left no more than a pair of saddle shoes. Then, divine intervention, another voice, an older woman's, bracing, proud, answered the man's question, the one Mara was sure had been posed to her. Mara skipped ahead, then looked over her shoulder. Saddle Shoes was at a safe remove. He was tall, his back was toward her. He was nearly nose to nose with this implausible, larger-than-life interloper. The predator turned prey. Mara smiled to herself and made her getaway. Bob could hardly remember the last time someone found him so interesting. This Mrs. Silverman... This Mrs. Silverman seemed so tickled by his every observation that at any moment he half expected her to take his arm and invite him to a home-cooked meal. Her full name was Iris Silverman, she confided. She was a retired schoolteacher from the Upper West Side and a sucker for people who loved art like she loved art. Bob played along, mixing half-remembered details from one of his art history classes with tidbits from a television program on the ancients he'd recently seen on PBS.